Hello and welcome to today's partner web conference. This is Fast Track Dynamics 365 for Finance and Operations Enterprise Edition Tech Talk. Today's topic, on-premises local business data deployment. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Senior Solution Architect Sachin Gandhi. So without any further delay, Sachin, over to you.
Thanks, Janice. Hello, everyone. I'm Sachin Gandhi. I work for the Customer and Partner Success team in Microsoft. Welcome to this tech talk on on-premises deployment for D365 for Finance and Operations. In this tech talk, we will look at the use cases for on-premises deployment, what you need to consider between going on-premise and maybe using the cloud option, and looking at the system requirements for the on-premises deployment, hardware and software, and some sizing guidance that we have put out there. We will also look at how to sort of, get the things licensed and how to get your lifecycle services project for on-premises provisioned. Then we will basically focus on how to deploy the environment. There is a lot of manual stuff that you have to do to get the on-premises environment up and running. So we will look at the prerequisite hardware, what you need there, how to get the service fabric cluster set up. We'll also look at how to get the LCS connector with the local agent deployed and connected to LCS. And then we will also look at how to deploy the environment from LCS to your on-premises environment. We will also then look at what features are not available or work differently for on-premises, and then we will probably leave some time for question and answers. So hopefully this agenda looks good for everyone. So I'll move on to the reasons for using on-premises. So as kind of I saw the poll here, where you have a lot of you have corporate policy to keep the data local, but just as a lot of you working for the partner, just make sure that you talk to your customer and talk about in on-premises. Well, there's a lot of maintenance that the customer will be responsible for. Plus all the deployment complexities and things like that. Cloud first is our strategy from a Microsoft standpoint, so obviously the cloud solution would be a step ahead always of the on-premises deployment. So make sure that your customers have a valid reason to go on-premises, and if they could go to cloud, please ask them to at least evaluate the cloud option. There are the valid reasons from our standpoint to go on premises is basically data sovereignty issues, where you have some local or some corporate policies that prevent your data being sitting in the cloud. So data sovereignty would be a valid issue or valid case to go on premises. And then in cases where you have remote sites where the internet connectivity may not be as reliable, that could be another valid scenario for going on-prem. If you have other scenarios, then maybe you should consider our cloud option or talk to us just to at least you want to understand, other than these two scenarios, what are the other cases where you think cloud may not work. So please, help us be a cloud-first company and evaluate our cloud options there. From an architecture standpoint, basically the main difference in the on-premises deployment is that now we run everything on Service Fabric. So all the services and the applications we'll be installing would be running on top of the standalone Service Fabric cluster. So here in this architecture diagram, you will see that we have this big box, which is the Service Fabric standalone cluster in your on-premises environment. Each virtual machine has the Service Fabric installed on it, and then all services such as the financial reporting, your application object server, which hosts the AX application, the environment orchestrator, which basically orchestrates the deployment of the different components, and reporting services. So all these services basically will run on top of Service Fabric. And the shared infrastructure that will be required would be basically your SQL Server cluster, to host your databases, a storage cluster to basically serve as a file share. We need file share for two things. We will download the installation files from LCS and then basically deploy it to your on-prem. So there is agent share, which keeps the temporary files for installation. And then there is another share which will keep you the attachments that you attach in AX. So that's why you need a storage cluster. And then you will have your Active Directory and ADFS infrastructure for doing the local authentication in your on-premises environment. So that's sort of a high-level architecture. Moving on to the application lifecycle management architecture side of things. So the two things that will always be in the cloud are lifecycle services and Visual Studio Team Services. So when your developers do the development, whether they do the development in a VM, one box VM in the cloud, or they download the one box VM and run it on premises, those VMs will need to connect to Visual Studio Team Services, and the developer should be able to check in, check out code to the source control in VSTS. From there, you can have a build machine. The build machine will need to connect to VSTS, download the latest code, and do a build for you. From the build machine, you can then take the deployable packages and save them in the asset library, which is inside Lifecycle Services. And when you are trying to deploy an environment, you can then take the deployable package from Lifecycle Services, and then from LCS, you can apply the update or the deployable package to your environments which are on-prem. So in this diagram, you can see that there's a production environment and there is a sandbox environment. So in LCS, you will have the ability to basically go and push down an update or a deployable package to the production and the sandbox environment. Today, if you get it deployed, what you will see that once the environment is deployed, you have to basically hit delete on that environment, then reconfigure that environment with the new deployable package and push it down. We are working on kind of improving that story going forward, but that's what the process you will have to use. You will delete the environment. It doesn't delete the databases and stuff. It just basically removes the old version of the services on the service fabric. And then when you push down the new package, it will deploy a new version of the services on the service fabric, the one that you push down. So that's how you will basically do updates for now. So again, in this diagram, you can see your environments. The environment orchestrator, which is on your on-prem environment, will take the new deployable package and basically deploy the new assets to your service fabric cluster. Again, the shared infrastructure would again be your Active Directory, your file shares, and your SQL Server cluster. Okay. So there is some guidance we have put out from a hardware requirement standpoint. So what you would see, this is just a kind of a compiled table of that information that we have out. So from a minimum hardware requirement standpoint, we at least need 3 AOS nodes, 2 MR nodes, 1 SSRS node. So SSRS, we don't have scalability on that one yet. We are working on fixing that. So later on in the future, you will be able to scale out SSRS to multiple nodes. And we need at least 3 orchestrator nodes. Here are the minimum, basically, hardware requirements. So 8 cores for each AOS and about 24 gigs of RAM for AOS. Similarly, 4 gigs of 4 cores per MR or SSRS or orchestrator server, and 16 gigs of RAM per VM for these services. And if I kind of did the totals here, so you're looking at sort of 48 cores and 168 gigs of RAM at a minimum at your production environment. And this doesn't really include the sizing for your SQL Server, Active Directory, ADFS, and file share virtual machines or servers that you will be running. But hopefully some of these are already, part of the customer's infrastructure that you can basically re-leverage maybe. So that's kind of a high-level kind of minimum sizing requirements for the environment. On the SQL side, we are basically saying that you will need 2 instances of SQL because you will be doing clustering and keeping it in high availability mode. We are saying that at least 8 cores for SQL, and with 16 total of 16 cores between the 2 server, and 32 gigs of RAM per server at a minimum to go with it, and use SSDs for your SAN. So we have high IOPS on the database, as you probably have already know. AX needs a good storage for your database files for it to be performant. So that will be another requirement. Active Directory is probably already set up at a customer site, so not too much is sort of needed there, but you will have to host a new ADFS server or leverage the existing ADFS server to register the AX application, and we will use OpenID for authentication with Active Directory. Looking at sort of a network diagram kind of thing, so you will have your production environment here, with the service fabric cluster running in your on-premises environment with multiple AOS nodes, multiple management reporter nodes, multiple orchestrator nodes. Retail is not supported in the cloud today, so we cannot do retail. We have one SSRS node. It's part of the service fabric. Later on, we will be actually working on in scaling this out to multiple nodes. Your Active Directory shared infrastructure and your SQL Server shared infrastructure that's shown in this diagram. Let's move on to how to sort of basically get the customer licensed and how do we sort of provision their lifecycle services project for on-premises deployment. So once the customer goes through the purchasing cycle and purchases the license, as a partner, you will have to go to something called the Partner Business Center, and that's where you will be able to find the license serial number for the customer. So you will have to do as a partner and share that with the customer. Then here I have a link for provisioning guide, which basically guides you through the steps that you have to go through to get your lifecycle services project provisioned. So once you have the license serial number and you have the lifecycle services project provision, in the lifecycle services project settings, you can go to the ownership and organizations and ownership tab and paste in your serial number and save it there. That's the way you will basically license your on-premises deployment. So just a couple steps here, just, get your license serial number from the Partner Business Center and then use this provisioning guide to sort of, get your LCS project provision. That's the 2 main points on this slide. Moving on to sizing guidance. So we don't have very specific sizing guidance today, but we have at least put out some generic guidance out there that can help you sort of size up your environment. So what we are saying is 3,000 to 15,000 transaction lines per hour per core. So this sizing is based on a per core based sizing. Based on the complexity of transaction or the modules that you're using, you may want to be at the lower end or the higher end of it. So if I find a customer doing a lot of complex kind of transactions on the SQL side, then I will probably tend to go towards using the 3K number to come up with the number of cores. Or if I see that they're just doing simple transactions, then I'll probably just tend towards the 15,000 transaction lines per hour per core kind of math. Typically, we see a 3:1 AOS to SQL ratio, but if the customer is heavy on batch jobs and batch processes, then you may want to look at a 2.5:1 AOS to SQL ratio, or maybe 2:1 AOS to SQL ratio. and anywhere between 2 to 4 gigs of RAM per core. So this sizing is per core, and you will have to then convert the core into the number of VMs and things like that from there. Similarly, for AOS, we have about 2,000 to 6,000 transaction lines per core, 16 GB of RAM per instance, and anywhere from 10 to 15 enterprise users, or 15 to 25 activity users, or 25 to 50 team users per core. So you can basically, create an Excel spreadsheet, put this math in there, and then sort of come up with how many machines you will need to run the environment. So moving on to steps to deploy. So once you sort of have your sizing, you can start looking at how to deploy a sandbox environment or production environment. So steps for deploying, you basically need your LCS project for on-premise provision as a prerequisite. Then you will need some basic infrastructure like we saw in the various diagrams. You will need your Active Directory, your domain services, SQL Server 2016 SP1 cluster, a file share. So if you can talk to the customer and see what is already there, and look at what are the things you will have to install to get at least the basic stuff up and running. Then for installing AX or Dynamics 365 for operations, you will need to create additional VMs or actual physical hardware for Orchestrator, AOS, Management Reporter, and SSRS. Assign static IPs to that, so you have valid IPs all the time, and then you will have to domain join those VMs. We do provide scripts for doing that, so you can use those scripts rather than manually going and clicking through the forms to do that. Prerequisite software, again, the prerequisite software, we now have scripts to help you install the prerequisite software, but I'm just covering it here just so you know. So on the AOS side, we need some ODBC drivers, the .NET frameworks, IIS. We don't run anything on IIS, but we need some DLLs that are installed as part of the IIS installation. So that's the reason you need IIS installed. SQL Server Management Studio, and some C++ redistributable and Access DB engine. Those are the things that sort of get used on the AOS side. On the BI side, we need the .NET frameworks, SQL Server Management Studio, and SQL Server Reporting Services. On the MR nodes, we just need the .NET frameworks to be updated there. Here, there is a link in my deck for the setup documentation, so you can follow that if you haven't already looked it over already. So once we have just the VMs up and running for the various infrastructure nodes, what we need to do is go into our DNS and register these two names. One for AX, so it can point to your AOS nodes on Service Fabric, and another name for your Service Fabric, the orchestrator nodes on your Service Fabric, so that when we navigate to this name, we end up on one of the AOS nodes, or we end up on one of the orchestrator nodes. So this is what you will have to basically add the A records in your DNS for that. So then you can basically go to the LCS shared asset library in Lifecycle Services and download the installation files. The installation files is basically a set of artifacts, a lot of PowerShell scripts, and some config files. So, but the main file that you will be working with is this file called config-template.xml file. And this file is basically a way for you to specify some parameters that then will be used by the rest of the scripts to deploy the environment. So let me just walk you through the config-template.xml that I used for my lab environment. So here, if I go, this is my config-template.xml file. And here you will see that the first section is about the Active Directory service accounts. So this section will be used by the scripts to create the service accounts in Active Directory that will be then used to run the various services like your management reporter service, the AX service. So in this section, you have the opportunity to change the name of the service account. If you want to keep the names between dev, test, and different environments separate, you can do that, or you can sort of go with the default we provide. So this template will be available for you when you download the folder. You just need to review the information here and make the necessary changes. The next section is the certificate section. So we will be basically encrypting all the traffic between the different nodes, between your on-prem environment and any communications with LCS, also the encrypting the traffic between your Service Fabric nodes and SQL Server. So we need various certificates to basically encrypt the communication. And for that, you could use two approaches. You could go and acquire valid certificates from VeriSign or GoDaddy or whichever your provider is. So we recommend that for the production environment, for your test environment, you can maybe use self-signed certificates. So here in this case, in this file, you will basically look at the different certificates that are needed. A few sections that you have to modify is basically this protect to, so which user will have the access to access the private certificate. So you basically, specify that here. Rest, you don't have to. Basically, you can let everything else be the default. The thumbprint will be empty at the beginning. But when you run our scripts to generate the self-signed certificate, those scripts will automatically update the thumbprint for the certificates that it will generate for you. So we have a Service Fabric certificate, a Service Fabric client certificate, a Service Fabric encryption certificate, then session authentication certificate, data encryption, data signing, financial reporting services, and orchestrator for your on-prem local agent. So these are the various certificates that will be used for your on-prem deployment. Here, then there is another section about the database server. So here you just basically specify the name of the SQL user and the name of your AXDB. So the application will understand that, and the scripts will be able to refer to that. Then the main node is really the Service Fabric cluster node. So here you will see that in this is the cluster name. So you can pick a cluster name for your Service Fabric cluster and specify that here. Then here, this first node type is the AOS node type. And in my setup, I have three nodes here. So each node stands for each AOS node that I will be deploying to my Service Fabric. So instead of 3, if I let's say have 4, then I will have the scripts to create 4 nodes of AOS. So in here you have to specify the name of your AOS VM and then the IP address of that machine. And similarly, you have to do that for the orchestrator type. So all for your orchestrator nodes. And for your reporting server node, again, you can only have 1 today. And then your management reporter nodes. So once you specify this, then this section will be used basically to create the scripts or the config files for deploying the Service Fabric cluster. So the main thing you will be doing basically when you download the files would be basically modifying the config template.xml to make sure everything looks good there, and then you can proceed with the rest of the deployment. So going back to my slide, so once you have the config template.xml updated, you can run the script to say create new service account. So when you run this script, which is part of the install files, you will basically be able to just quickly create the service accounts needed based on data from the config template.xml file. Then you move on to creating your self-signed certificates for at least your sandbox environment. and you just run this other two scripts here, so the new self-signed certificate and the export PFX files. What these two scripts will do is basically create those self-signed certificates and then export them into a folder. So in my case, in my lab, you would see that, so these are the scripts that are downloaded, and when I ran the export certificate script, it created a folder called certs, and in this cert, it created the different certificates then that I can use later on for deploying my environment. Then once the certificates are created, you can run another script called export scripts.ps1. Again, the config template.xml file will be an input to that script, and that script will create one folder corresponding to each virtual machine that you will have in your environment. So going back to my lab, when I ran that script, it created this folder called VMs, and in the VM folder, I created multiple folders, each one corresponding to another virtual machine in my Service Fabric node. So in each of these folders, there are additional scripts and artifacts that we will need to then deploy to that particular VM with that name. So then what you do is you basically then take these folders, copy it to the corresponding machine, and then on that machine you run some additional scripts. So going back to my deck, so once you have the script, so here it's taking an MSI file path. So what the configure prerequisite script will do is install all the prerequisites based on given that the MSIs kind of exist at a shared path, and it will install all the prerequisites needed for that type of VM, that type of node. Then it will create the service accounts, register the service accounts on that machine, import the right kind of certificates that will be required on that machine, set the permissions on those certificates, and then you have this test the 365FO configuration.ps1 script, which will basically test that you have done all the steps before correctly, and you are ready to sort of now move on to your Service Fabric cluster deployment. To get the Service Fabric up and running, you have to basically download the Service Fabric standalone package and then install that on each of the VM that will be part of the Service Fabric cluster. Then you run another script that we provide, this sf cluster config.ps1 with the config template.xml as an input. And this script will generate another file called cluster config.json. This cluster config.json file, and then this cluster config.json file is used to create your Service Fabric cluster. So you take that new file and you use it as an input to the test configuration.ps1 command, which will basically let the Service Fabric basically test that it's ready for creating a Service Fabric cluster. And then you run the create Service Fabric cluster command, which will then go and create your Service Fabric cluster. So till this point, we will basically get a blank Service Fabric cluster running with no applications or services installed on it, and you will be able to navigate to the Service Fabric Explorer using your Service Fabric URL. So in my lab environment, just to show you how it will look, is if you go to this, this is how your Service Fabric Explorer will look. Here you see that I have 9 nodes, meaning I have 9 different virtual machines part of my cluster. You're seeing 8 applications and 14 services installed because I have already finished the install, but if you just get the Service Fabric installed, you won't really see any applications or services installed at that point. For that, we will move on to the next steps in the deployment. So before we get more stuff installed on the Service Fabric, we have to take care of a few other things. So we have to establish the connectivity between your local environment and your LCS tenant. So for that, there is this script, add cert to service principal script, which basically takes the thumbprint of your local agent certificate. You can get that from the config template.xml file, because that once you run the generate certificate scripts, it will basically be updated in your config template.xml file. So you can take that. When you run the script, it will ask you to log into your Azure environment where your Active Directory is, and it will basically register the thumbprint with the service principal with your Active Directory. Then you will have to go and create the file shares, one for agent and one for storing the attachments that you attach to AX. And then the step number 11 is to basically get SQL Server configured. So SQL Server only allows encrypted communication. So for that, you will generate another certificate and install the private certificate on the SQL side, install all the public certificate on all of your Service Fabric nodes. So we have the public-private kind of encryption with certificates. And then you will update the thumbprint of the certificate at this registry setting. So SQL Server then knows which certificate to use for encryption. And you will also then go into SQL Server Configuration Manager on the protocols. You will say force encryption equal to yes. So after you do that, your SQL Server will only accept basically encrypted traffic, and it will only accept the encrypted traffic from machines that have that public certificate installed. Okay, so we got the SQL up and running now. So now it's our time to get the databases deployed. If you look at the files we provide in the LCS shared asset library, you will see that we have two types of database. One is a demo database and one is a blank database. The blank database is not really blank. It has a few schemas in it that need to be there. So based on your scenario, you can either use restore the empty one or restore the demo data one. So you restore your AX database, and then you configure the permissions on each of the database, and you create your orchestrator and the financial reporting database as well. And then you have to basically, there is a file available in the folder called credentials.json. You take that file, and in that file you specify your SQL username and the password for the SQL. And you run this invoke service fabric encrypt text command to encrypt that file, and you place that file in the agent share under a folder named credentials. So what will happen is when the local agent is installed, it would try to look at this location, the agent share location, and try to find a file called credential.json, and the credentials there, it will try to use those credentials to basically connect to the database and talk to your databases there. So so that step is required to let a way of specifying the credentials to the local agent so that it can proceed with installing the rest of the application. For authentication, you run this other script, publish ADFS application group.ps1. This script basically goes and registers the different applications that we will need OpenID configuration for authentication. So in my lab environment, if I go to my ADFS server and look at my server manager, tools, ADFS management, you will see that I have an application group here called Microsoft Dynamics 365 for operation on premises. And if I look underneath that group is where you will see that I have 3 applications registered, one for financial reporting, one for the AX application, and one for the workflow designer. So if you double click on these, you will get to a client ID, and these client IDs would be needed in the last step of the application when we try to deploy the environment from LCS to your on-premises service fabric cluster. Okay, so that's the ADFS setup. So once we are here, we have actually got all the basic infrastructure configured properly. We have also our databases and everything set up properly. So now we can proceed with sort of connecting your local environment with lifecycle services. So for that, you have to install local agent. To get the local agent, you will go to lifecycle services. From there, you can download the local agent and a configuration file that goes with it. And then you run this command on your orchestrator node to basically install the local agent on the service fabric. The local agent would then establish the connectivity between lifecycle services and your environment. And when you go to lifecycle services and when everything is set up correctly, you'll be able to see the message called validation complete, agent connection established. So that means till this point, now LCS is connected to the local agent that installed on premises. Once you have the connectivity established, then you can go into LCS and there will be a configure button there that you can click on. And there is a lot of parameters you have to specify here, like for example, names of your file share that you have set up, the names of your database that you have set up, the different thumbprints of the different certificates that you will be using. So you specify that in this dialog here. And the last option you get in that dialog is to include a package, an AOT package that you have uploaded to the LCS asset library. You can include that as part of the installation, and then you can deploy from here. And what this will do is it will send a command to the local agent. The local agent will then download the right files from LCS, and then it will deploy the environment to your service fabric cluster. So when all said and done, and if everything goes right, what you will be able to see is a screenshot like this, where you have 8 applications installed on the Service Fabric cluster and 14 different services installed on the Service Fabric cluster. And once everything is successfully installed, then you can navigate to your AX URL, and you will be able to see the AX application running in your on-premises deployment. So that brings me to all the links to the various documentation. So just kind of quickly walk you through a little bit of that. So here, if I go to the landing page, here basically you have links to pretty much everything: overview, system requirements, hardware sizing, and how to get it, how to purchase it, and how to sort of get your lifecycle services project provision. Then all the links are here, and as we are working on improving our documentation, you will find that from the landing page you will be able to navigate most of it. Also, here I have a link to features not yet implemented. So this is quite a big list, because there are lots of differences between cloud and on-premises, and things that are available in the cloud are not available in on-premises. So we have things like Task Recorder, PowerBI.com integration, some issues with the SharePoint online or the SharePoint on-premises integration, electronic reporting. The warehouse app is not working right now, but we are planning to have support for it in one of the platform releases coming up. Bring your own database is not supported in on-premises. Retail is not supported in on-premises. I'm just calling out the main ones. Trace parser and the perf timer are also not available. SSRS is currently restricted to single node. We are working on the scale out story for that. And all the rich telemetry that is available in the cloud is not available on premises. So triaging issues and things like that will be a little more tedious if you're used to just logging into LCS and looking into the telemetry to detect problems. Few features that we don't intend to do anything about. So SSRS report viewer control doesn't work on premises for that. we will render the reports as PDF, and the document routing agent is really not required in an on-premises environment because you can connect to your local printer within your network easily. So the document routing agent doesn't apply to the on-premises deployment. If your customer has questions about Microsoft, what is the data that sort of gets uploaded to Lifecycle Services, or how does Microsoft classify data, or what certifications are available for Dynamics 365 for operations, please visit the Microsoft Trust Center. You will find a lot of information about compliance and privacy and things like that over there. The provisioning guide is a link that I've put in here. It was earlier in the article also, but this is where you will go to basically get your Lifecycle Services project provisioned. This is a link which is also part of the landing page, but how to sort of purchase Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. With that, that brings me to my Q&A slide deck, and we can probably have some time for Q&A. It seems like we have a good 15 minutes remaining. Okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can go ahead and do so by using the white text box in the lower left-hand side of your screen. And while we wait for some of those questions to come in, I'd like to bring your attention to a link that I just posted in the messages panel. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference. And we ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference or have feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. And I am going to go ahead and turn it back over to Sachin to answer any questions that have come in. Sachin?
Yep. So I'll be looking at the messages coming in here and try to respond to those. Yeah, so there's a question I'm reading here. What are the best practices for pre-prod instances? So my recommendation is that, as far as your development and unit testing is concerned, use the single box VM, whether you run that VM in the cloud or purchase it as a subscription from Microsoft or deploy it in your Azure subscription or run it on premises, doesn't really matter. So for your development and your unit testing, use the one box. For your what I call multi-user testing, you should then have a service fabric on-premises employment with multiple nodes to be able to test that. For your integration testing, you probably want a similar environment which sort of replicates what you will have in production. So there is another question here. Is service fabric setup required each time the setup is performed? So you will deploy the service fabric once. The service fabric cluster would be created once, and then you can from LCS basically deploy multiple times to the same service fabric cluster, meaning you can keep updating the application on the service fabric cluster from LCS multiple times. You don't have to take the whole cluster down and things like that. You will set up the cluster once, and then you will push your deployment from LCS the first time, and then you can push in updates as many times as you like without changing anything on the service fabric. Should I separate the batch AOS from normal AOS? So in here, we don't really give you that option to separate the AOS for batch versus the AOS for interactive. I think we have a setting in the application to basically throttle the batch. So say I only want to use 30% of the capacity for batches, and that's how you can basically then make sure that your users are not impacted if there's batch activity going on. There are a lot of questions around, can we get the PowerPoint? Yes, I think it will be shared. So Janice can probably tell you the information, but yeah, the PowerPoint and this deck will be available for you. Okay, I'll wait here to see if there are any more questions. So I have a question here, which basically, if I want to rephrase it, basically saying we want to connect to ESTS. Do we need to have a local instance, an on-premises instance for that? My recommendation there is just to use a single box VM. You can host the VM in Azure. You can outright basically buy a subscription for a dev VM to basically have it deployed in the Microsoft subscription, or you could basically run the VM in your on-prem Hyper-V and then connect to VSTS from there. But yeah, you probably want to restrict your development to one box VM and not try to use the multi-box, the Service Fabric cluster environment for developing code. Why is the hardware requirement so much higher than the cloud? Well, really the thing is, the new thing that we are using here is the Service Fabric, and the Service Fabric basically needs a few things. Like, for example, it at least needs 3 nodes in order to have a quorum. That's why the main service, that is the orchestrator service, needs at least 3 nodes. And we just want to make sure that this is a highly available environment to deploy. So that's why the Service Fabric and multiple nodes of each service is needed. So that's kind of the short answer for that. Hi, Sachin. I would like to know if it's possible to reduce machine numbers collapsing 2 or more nodes on the same machine. Really, I won't recommend that, and I haven't really tried doing that myself, so no. You can probably try to host multiple VMs on the same hardware, and that way you can have multiple VMs and multiple nodes on hardware on the same hardware. So you can try that. But for production environment, obviously, if you have shared infrastructure underneath, you will have performance impact, things like that. So be careful with that. Yeah, there's another message, something about an error during financial reporting. So please open a support case for that, because based on whatever issue you have, either if you have run into it, you can probably get a quick answer, or the support team can help you look into it and triage it for you. Okay, I am waiting for more questions to come in. Okay, looks like those are all the questions we have today.
All right. Thank you, Sachin. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to conclude today's Learning Media web conference. Attendees may access the web conference recording via the same registration link used to attend today's live broadcast. The PowerPoint deck will be made available in the follow-up messaging. Please look for an email from Event Builder in the next couple of days that will include details on how to access that. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Sachin, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.